Another edition and the first one of the week of Beat the Closing Number presented by thelines.com. My name is Eli Herskovich. You can follow The Lines on Twitter at TheLinesUS. Be sure to price shop every single MLB betting market over at TheLines.com. And you could follow, on that note, our MLB lead analyst at Monowara on Twitter, one of the best baseball bettors around. And I say that with tailing experience, to say the least. But before we get started, Mo, remember, for our listeners and viewers, whether you're checking us out on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your favorite podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube specifically, head over to the thumbs up button below this screen and you could like the video, aka give it a thumbs up and ring the bell to get notifications whenever The Lines releases a new sports betting video on any market, including Mo's day-to-day MLB bets, which you could also find in real time over at thelines.com in our Discord channel. And you could subscribe to Mo individually and get notifications when Mo places a bet in real time, so you can place it with him per se and get the best of the number. You can also head over to play.thelines.com for your chance to win a $25 Amazon gift card daily in our MLB Pick'em contest. But Mo, before we get started with our 3 games for Tuesday's card here on June 20th, looking at Cardinals, Nats in chronological order, Red Sox, Twins, and Dodgers, Angels. How did your bets go over the weekend and Monday, for that matter?
Slight loser, I think. Maybe winning if you count Friday. I had one disastrous day where I got scooped. Multiple 6-run leads lost this weekend for me. The Angels, that was the big disaster. They were up 8-2 in the 7th against arguably the worst team in Major League Baseball, and they could not manage to win the game. They couldn't even manage to get to extra innings, if you can believe that. So, yeah, that day was a complete disaster, but I got almost all of it back the last couple days. So roughly break even, I think, maybe slightly ahead, counting Friday.
And I know Mo is pretty humble when it comes to not just betting on baseball, but his day-to-day bets in general and futures, whatnot. But Mo is up over 20 units when it comes to his baseball bets as a whole. And you could check out all those again in our Discord channel over at thelines.com in the top right-hand corner and get those bets in real time, like I mentioned earlier. But my weekend, though, I was in Vegas, stayed at Circa Sports. Our friends over at Circa hooked us up, my girlfriend and I, and played some blackjack at night with her. We were up a good amount, won't disclose the specific amount, and then we lost it. So we pretty much broke even, and I was able to...
South Park meme?
South Park
meme. And it's gone.
And it's gone. And I won't disclose whether it was her doing or my doing, but nonetheless, we lost most of it. I was able to put some down on some futures, one being a little bit more on my college basketball future, my lone one that you could find over at thelines.com. But yeah, it was fun start, fun overall, fun night, but would have been nice to keep the amount that we were up, if not more. But I digress, Mo. Let's get to the 3 games on tonight's slate, Tuesday for Major League Baseball, 7:05 p.m. Eastern Time, first pitch. Cardinals at Nationals. Believe it or not, the St. Louis Cardinals, 13 games below 500, are only 8 games out, which may seem like a wide margin, and it is, the first place Reds, but considering how down the Central is this year, I don't think it's necessarily insurmountable. And when you look at base runs, which you reference a lot, and we talk about, or at least I mention the word regression a lot on any podcast I do, I don't think it's crazy to assume that the Reds will regress at some point this season. Heck, they're on a 9-game winning streak. And going back to this matchup in particular, Cardinals, like I mentioned, 13 games below the Mendoza mark, and the Nationals 17 games below 500. It is Jordan Montgomery taking on another southpaw in Mackenzie Gore. And when you look at St. Louis's offense, they exploded a bit yesterday after trailing 5-0, coming back and overcoming that deficit. And the Nationals overall have lost 8 of their last 10 games. St. Louis actually has its first 3-game winning streak since the beginning of May. And St. Louis's offense got a boost on Monday. Lars Nootbaar, and defensively, too, back in the Cardinals lineup, activated off of the injured list. And St. Louis will have an interesting timeshare between Nootbaar, Dylan Carlson, who has not lived up to the hype, at least offensively, Tommy Edman, infielder turned center fielder this season, Jordan Walker, primetime prospect, at least at the plate, has not performed well in the outfield. Paul DeJong, who probably above average at most shortstop, and has been kept in the lineup because of his bat. And we'll see how the Cardinals decide to go about things with Gorman as well, considering he's more of importance when it comes to his bat versus his glove. And going back to Walker really quick, Walker is, I believe, a natural third baseman first and foremost. So going back to the price for this matchup, Cardinals between -145 and -150 on the money line. So that price tag really hasn't budged since the opener. How are you betting the first of 3?
I got the Nats. Been riding the Nats against lefties all season, basically, since like first few weeks when they were hitting lefties hard, and I thought it was probably real. They've sank some since then, but still have a pretty strong number hitting lefties this year. Actually hitting them better than the Cardinals, which the Cardinals were extremely elite hitting lefties last year. They're not killing them this year like they were. They've actually been a little, like I said, below what the Nationals have done. I think it's mostly
kind of like the
BABIP.
White Sox.
What'd you say?
Kind of like the White Sox in terms of really taking a step back after being in the upper echelon of WRC plus against lefties.
Yeah, I think it's mostly BABIP related that they're below the Nationals. Like they're hitting for more power, so I'm still projecting them better. But even with that, I still think the Nationals are too big of underdogs here. The projections love Jordan Montgomery, but I think he's been noticeably worse this year. Getting hit harder, hard hit percent up about 5%. Swinging strikes, he's lost multiple percents. He's gone from above average to below in that department. And his chase rate is also a little below average. So I think Montgomery not quite as strong. Maybe it's the baseball. Maybe it's just normal regression. But yeah, he I think is about on the same level as Gore. I just really like this matchup for Gore, though. Like you said before about Paul Goldschmidt, I think it was just when we were talking about baseball. I can't even remember if it was on the show, but you were talking about how, his bat has slowed down considerably and he has a tough time catching up to high velocity.
It's wild, man. And watching it live, it's not just from a metric perspective that I'm seeing that. You watch it live, and Goldschmidt has been and still is, even though he's, 36 at this point, one of the best hitters in baseball, even statistically, from a traditional sense. And it's wild just to see his bat speed that slow to a 95-mile-an-hour heater right down the middle of the plate, middle.
Yeah, I've definitely seen him miss some of these pitches as well this year. And I think it's just being reflected overall in what St. Louis has done this year. They're a team that has, even though they've hit very well, this is what's crazy, is they've hit the ball very well this year overall, but they've struggled against four-seamers. They're 25th in baseball, and that's not good against Mackenzie Gore. He is very, very fastball heavy, 60%. So super reliant on his heater, and I think that's going to be really good for him here. So this one's already started to come down. I got plus 130, but I still think 125 is still good, which is where it's pretty much at across the market here.
By the way, just going back to the Cardinals, and we love to talk about formerly our St. Louis Cardinals, although like I hit on from the get-go with this matchup, I kind of declared the Cardinals dead last week. Maybe it's just my optimism after they took 2 or 3 from the Mets. I'm not going to ask you the question. I'm not going to pose futures question for you in regards to their NL Central futures price at around plus 750 to win the division, because I don't think you would go in their favor. The Cubs have been hot too, and they actually have the fourth shortest odds, so the fourth worst odds, even though they're only 3 back. Speaking of how wide open the NL Central is. But looking at who the Cardinals played during their struggles, even after the 2-day stretch of where they had off. And I thought that was going to make a world of difference for St. Louis. It, in fact, did not at the beginning of June, late May, when they played Pittsburgh on the road and then at Texas, then the Reds at home, then the Giants, and then at the Mets, where they just took 2 or 3. And they lost all those series before that, aka against Pittsburgh, Texas, Cincinnati, and San Francisco. And those are all upper echelon teams, or at least the Reds are in first place, all first place-ish teams. Pirates got swept by the Brewers over the weekend. Upper echelon teams, I could say that, in their respective divisions. So, yes, good teams need to resurface and get back on track against the elite or above average teams in any sport to make a run. But you can make the case against maybe some more cupcake teams on their upcoming schedule. Cardinals may catch a break in late June, early July, because they'll get the Yankees, for instance, without Aaron Judge. He's not expected to come back until after the All-Star break. So just maybe of note, maybe if the Cardinals want any shot of making a run at the NL Central, because they're not going to get the wild card, then they're going to have to do it now. They have the Nats, they have the Cubs in London this weekend. Then they play the Astros, who are struggling in their own right of late. Then the Yankees, like I mentioned, and then the Miami Marlins, who, speaking of regression, they have to regress at some point. But that'll be the last time I say regression, at least on this episode. So, like always, I regress about my St. Louis Cardinals. Mo, on to the second game, 6:40 p.m. Eastern time, first pitch. Red Sox, you cashed on Boston last night. 3 games over 500. They've won their last 5 games. And this actually showcases the dichotomy between 2 divisions. Another central division, speaking of the American League, and they're in Minnesota. The Twins, who are 36-37, sit in first place in the AL Central, 2 games ahead of the Guardians. And Boston, 3 games over 500, are in last place in the American League East. So if the Red Sox win the AL Central, obviously they would be in first place. Just pretty wild looking at these 2 divisions with how competitive the AL East is this year and pretty much every single season, but especially this season. Boston taking the first of the 3-game set against Minnesota last night, 9-3. But Twins still priced between -137, -145 on the money line, and it is Cutter Crawford as a dog tonight, 4.20 ERA versus his 3.20 xERA. So might be pitching a bit below expectations when it comes to his peripherals, going up against Bailey Ober. And 7 earned runs, Ober's given up in his last 4 starts, pitching very well for the Twins, not just of late, but this season. And he was one of their more up-and-coming pitching prospects when it came to their rotation. So how are you betting Red Sox Twins second game of 3, Mel?
Once again, I have Boston. Yeah, like you said, they did come through for me yesterday. I think pretty dominating game, to be honest. The score didn't really reflect it until later in the game. But they had they stranded so many base runners. I was getting quite frustrated tracking that one, while the Twins immediately, of course, hit a home run when they got men on base to make that one like more of a game than it should have been. Yeah, one big number I'm looking at in this one that's just got my attention big time is just, dude, Cutter Crawford's chase rate is obscene this year. I mean, 40%. That's Jacob deGrom territory. I know it's 40 innings, but that's still a lot of innings to have a 40% chase rate. Like, it's really hard to fake that. He's had some interesting splits, and like spots where you just wonder what his true talent level is. He's had trouble with lefties in his career, which makes sense for a guy who was projected as a reliever. Lefty power in particular has hurt him, but as a starter, he hasn't been quite as good as well. So I do wonder how he's going to shake out going forward. But man, 40% chase rate. I mean, that just makes me wonder and thinks like he might be pretty good. So I have him projected really close to Ober, to be honest. And Boston's lineup is better than Minnesota's, even though Minnesota has gotten a bit healthier of late. But I still think Boston does have a slightly better lineup. This edge is a bit thinner than the others. I think if Crawford is close to Ober, though, they can't be this big of underdogs. Plus 120 with the better lineup here. It's just too much for me. I think that I wouldn't really go past plus 120, but this one really hasn't moved, so the 120 is still available. So I do like Boston again here.
And I want to dig this up really quickly. You mentioned the Twins lineup, and I would agree with you, to say the least, that the Red Sox lineup, especially from a productivity standpoint, is better than Minnesota. And in regards to the Twins and how they've produced with runners in scoring position, I bring this up with a lot of lineups that we discuss when it applies to WRC plus, which is weighted runs created plus with runners in scoring position. And Minnesota, I think it took them over 2 months of the season to score any runs with the bases loaded and nobody out, which is unlucky to an extent, but it also goes to show you how much they've struggled. And the Twins with runners in scoring position, it's ironic because over that span, they couldn't do anything with the bases loaded and nobody out, but they actually rank third in baseball when it comes to WRC plus and runners in scoring position. But their offense, when runners haven't been in scoring position, has not produced. Byron Buxton, I think, is hitting around 215 in terms of traditional batting average. So Correa is starting to get hot, which definitely has helped the Twins produce with runners on base. But we'll see how Minnesota does tonight against an overly talented starter when it comes to stuff plus two. You mentioned with Cutter Crawford and his respective stuff. It's very similar to Brian Bayo for the Red Sox, who we saw dominate very below average Yankees lineup on Sunday Night Baseball, and Boston ended up sweeping that series. And by the way, I saw this with New York's lineup overall this season, and context matters. I'm not just going to throw you a Buster only stat without prefacing that the Yankees lineup is very banged up on top of Aaron Judge and has been for a lot of this season. And that's been the case for last 3 or 4 years with these guys. Pretty injury prone lineup with DJ LeMahieu, Giancarlo Stanton, et cetera, et cetera. So Aaron Judge, Harrison Bader, I tweeted this out earlier today at Eli Hershkovich. Judge, Bader, Stanton, and Donaldson have combined for 102 hits overall this season. That has a lot to do with how much time they've spent on the injured list. Luis Ariz for the Miami Marlins, who was traded from Minnesota this past offseason in the Pablo Lopez deal, has 102 hits himself this year. So while the Marlins have outperformed when it comes to base runs, and that Fangraphs metric, stat, whatever you want to call it, when you look at the standings and how Miami has gotten lucky to an extent and has outperformed even the traditional run differential and what their record should be, because they're somehow the Miami Marlins are in first place in the NL wildcard standings. But back to Ariz and the Yankees lineup. That just goes to show you how banged up New York is and how bad their offense is with those injuries, because Ariz has been dominant for Miami when it comes to getting on base, and the Yankees have been extremely unlucky with injuries, especially with Aaron Judge, who is still on the injured list for the foreseeable future. Any comments on that before we get to the final game on your card, Mo?
Yeah, do you think Minnesota could maybe use a rise. I like that trade for them still, and I loved it at the time. So I'm not really gonna be a captain hindsight here, but they could really. I think honestly, when I'm looking at why Minnesota has struggled with runners on, I mean, just look at their strikeout rate. I think that's like, I mean, they're not putting the ball in play. They have the worst strikeout rate in MLB, I believe. So they are number one in strikeout rate as far as the bad end of it against right-handed pitching, and they're number two against lefties. I mean, just it's so bad. They just have such a strikeout prone lineup that it's just causing them dry spells because getting runners on has not resulted in as many base knocks or walks as it really should.
Going back to your original question, and great points from you there, I do think the Twins could use Luis Ariz right now. And Pablo Lopez, we both thought that he would keep up what he was doing over the first month or so, month and change last year when he was in the Cy Young conversation early on in 2022. We thought he would remain in the race. I know rightfully so. I'm not calling you out for this by any means. When we were talking about Twins starting pitchers early on this season, and Joe Ryan, Cy Young, is started to drift back for sure in the race because of how he's performed, but still in the race. By the way, your guy, Kevin Gossman, is very much a contention for that award. I will say that. Good call on your end a few weeks ago. But you mentioned how you thought Lopez was going to remain probably most in contention among him, Ryan, and Sonny Gray the rest of the way. I think that's how you framed it. Maybe you said it was Gray, but I do think you said Lopez, and rightfully so, because his stuff is very good, but he hasn't performed well of late. So that definitely hurts Minnesota. I'm not trying to judge things by a sample size, especially a short sample size, because the Twins definitely needed Lopez when it came to their early season results and how well he performed on the mound. But I think they could definitely use a rise right now when it comes to their lineup, even though Correa is finally starting to hit and get back to his usual production. We'll see if it sustains itself. Last game is a great one. Can't wait to get to this because speaking of another underperforming team and talk about mismanagement, I think there are a lot of parallels between many of these teams that we've hit on today on the podcast and this last one. In regards to the matchup itself, one of them is no exception because the Dodgers are relatable to the Yankees as they've sustained some injuries, especially in their bullpen, that has impacted their recent results. Injuries, generally speaking, because the Yankees have, for the most part, a healthy-ish bullpen. Their lineup has been banged up. That's been their biggest concern on top of the rotation. I don't think Rodon has made a start yet for New York, even though he's been coming back for the last week, last 2 weeks, last 3 weeks. That is seemingly the story for Carlos Rodon going back to his entire career. Whatever, 5, 6, 7 years, going back to his White Sox days. White Sox, we could say for another conversation for another day. But Clayton Kershaw taking on Reed Detmers in this individual matchup. And the Angels, even though they haven't made up much ground in the AL West standings, they, I believe, are in the AL wildcard race when it comes to having one of those spots as of now, one of the 3 spots. They are no longer trailing in the American League wildcard race. And the Dodgers are actually between a -130, -140 favorite, despite getting swept against the Giants. And the Dodgers bullpen injuries played a big role in that regard over the weekend, especially on Friday, blowing a 4-0 lead. And the comparison I was going to make on top of the Yankees injuries was the St. Louis Cardinals, because the Cardinals didn't address their pitching concerns coming into the season for the most part. And the Dodgers did not address their bullpen concerns. And it is coming back to haunt them a bit of late here, even though the market still likes LA. Kind of similar to St. Louis in that regard, too. So how are you betting Dodgers Angels here, Mo?
Unfortunately, fading my beloved Angels here. Yeah, the Dodgers, they've been, even though like I've talked a lot about how the Angels have smashed lefties all year, and we don't really talk about the Dodgers as being a strong lineup against lefties because they've actually been much better against right-handed pitching in recent years. But after kind of a slow start, they've been better than the Angels this year against lefties, actually, as strong as the Angels have been. So that's definitely a point in their favor in this lefty-lefty matchup here. They also have the better pitcher by quite a bit here. I like Reed Detmers, and I've bet him a lot in the past, but he's a solid, slightly above average pitcher. But I still have him projected around a 4 ERA. He's been a bit unlucky this year, I think. Possibly his defense has let him down in some spots. But Clayton Kershaw, I mean, this guy, I mean, nobody ever talks about how everyone always talks about how ageless some of these other guys are, Justin Verlander, Max Scherzer. Nobody talks about how Clayton Kershaw is still not only performing, but projecting at an elite level, near a 3 ERA at age, 35, 36. I still think he's, I mean, Tom Tango has him as the Cy Young favorite by a good amount, I think. So I am still skeptical of that due to my feeling that he's inevitably going to go on the IL. But regardless, he's been great, and he's projecting great as well. So a pretty big pitching advantage, even though Detmers is solid, and then a pretty small, but I think better than the numbers would say, batting advantage. I say that because the Angels are once again dealing with multiple position player injuries. It's not the Mike Trouts and the Shohei Ohtanis at the top of the lineup. That is not the issue, but missing Gio Urshela, he's been mediocre this year, but has been a good hitter against lefties in his career. So I think that does affect them when they face a left-handed pitcher. Anthony Rendon, once again on the IL. You want to talk about the Carlos Rodon of batting. Like I said in the Discord,
The
Rendon
Carlos
to the IL.
Rodon of batting. I love it. So
Rendon to the IL, drink. I mean, this guy is just never ending with him. And while he has been hurt and struggled some, I mean, I think he's been a roughly average batter this year, but he has a 360 xWOBA this year. I mean, so I think it affects their projection for sure against a lefty here. And Zach Neto went on the IL last week. He's been great for them. Okay defense, and his bat has been tremendous for them, especially considering his position, So the bottom of the lineup, I guess what I'm saying is a bit of a mess for the Angels. And specifically in this matchup too, I know that they've been very good overall against lefties, and they project to hit lefties a bit better because of guys like Hunter Renfroe and Brandon Drury. But specifically against left-handed sliders, I was checking into this because Kershaw, we know he's so slider heavy. 292 xWOBA against left-handed sliders, not too much better on the actual production as well. So I think it's a decent spot for Kershaw to do a little better than the projections think. And I thought the Dodgers should be closer to minus 140 here, even though they are facing a good pitcher and a good lineup here. But this one really hasn't moved, so I don't anticipate this one getting bet too much. So people should still be able to get about what I got, which was minus 130.
Well, I do want to challenge you a little bit on that. Not the pick, because I agree with your analysis there. But the market movement, not just when it comes to money line, but total even and props. I kind of want to throw some things at you and try to get your perspective on it. So when it comes to the money line market, the Angels were actually opened as high, very soft opener, you could say, but opened as high as around plus 130 yesterday afternoon. So they did open as bigger dogs. Money came in as it generally happens. It's not like you don't see any baseball dog get shortened by 20 cents. It happens with soft openers. And generally speaking, when Mo brings up a market like the money line odds for any baseball game, we're going to be talking about the consensus odds where they opened, which would be in their latter part of the evening when most sports books, other than the few that open soft openers, especially nationwide books, because DraftKings, FanDuel, usually the books to open first, and those are soft openers, aka lower limits on those markets. But I digress. Going back to the total on top of the money line, the total opened at 9. It was actually bet down to 8, juiced 8 towards the over, but still minus 120 over 8. So even money for the under. Back up to 9 now. And in terms of props here, especially for pitchers, in regards to the way you're thinking about this game, it somewhat correlates because Reed Detmers, who's going for the Angels, his over-under outs prop, so outs recorded, first opened at 17.5, and it was juiced towards the under expectedly, which would be, quick math here, would be 5 innings or less. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
Less than 6.
Less than 6, right. Less than 6 innings for Detmers. And now it's down to 16.5. Over is juiced to minus 140, under minus 105. So you gave your take on the money line. You like the Dodgers. So whether it's the total, and total also is a chunk of the way you expect the pitching matchup to go between Kershaw, a Cy Young candidate, which you hit on, and also Reed Detmers, and your expectations for him in this start against a Dodgers lineup that has performed a lot better of late against left-handed pitching. So whether it's the Detmers prop, even Detmers walks, which has gotten bet up when it comes to the over there in that market. I brought up a lot of different markets. So however you want to take this, Mo, from anything I've thrown at you over the last minute or so.
Yeah, I did see that the Dodgers or the Angels rather got steamed overnight, which I think is what created the value that I think is there on the Dodgers. So obviously hoping that was a little bit of a fake from the Sharps. We see that all the time where there is a move down and then sometimes they hammer the other side. But out of these kind of like, I would be interested in Dodgers team total over, I think, especially if, like you said, if we're looking at a shorter Reed Detmers outing, the Angels' middle relief is pretty pitiful at times, as we saw when they completely imploded against the Royals, and then even struggling in multiple games against the Royals, even in games where they won, just allowing multiple base runners and then having to get out of jams repeatedly.
And looking at this thing, I also want to pick your brain on this. I know this podcast is usually 10 to 15 minutes, but baseball season is starting to heat up and NBA season is over. And maybe we'll clip this game off separately versus the entire baseball podcast. But looking at this thing spot-wise, because we haven't really talked about situational spots, and every handicapper looks at this thing differently. So I'm kind of curious to pick your brain, especially for this, and maybe it applies to more of the Cincinnati Reds because they've won 9 straight games, but you have to think the Dodgers it's an 162 game season. I kind of want to ultra preface here because I am not saying back the Dodgers just because they were swept by the San Francisco Giants over the weekend. Not saying that by any means. So please don't take this out of context. The Angels have been playing very good baseball of late. Therefore, from a market rating standpoint and from a price perspective, the market is backing the Angels for good reason. They are playing better baseball, and the market sees value in a team for many other reasons on top of this one that is starting to heat up. And like you mentioned, they have one of the better offenses in the game. We hit on that last week in the couple of breakdowns that we did, even without Anthony Rendon in the lineup. That goes without saying, with the odds on and then some AL MVP favorite. We also did a separate video on that you can find on the Lines YouTube page. Over to search the Lines on YouTube. So an elite Angels lineup coupled with an Angels pitching staff and bullpen to an extent that has performed a bit better of late. The Dodgers on top of the Giants getting swept by them over the weekend, have performed worse. So the market is a bit lower on them. Do you agree with that notion at the least? Again, situational spot-wise, I am not saying going as far as that over the course of a 162-game season. But do you see where I'm going with my logic there, Mo?
Not something I usually pay much attention to just because, it's different from like basketball where like, okay, you can play harder in basketball, right? And like bring more energy and that's going to like do things for you.
But maybe market price. Let's say the Dodgers, because I don't think you would disagree with this. If the Dodgers were their usual 15 or 16 games over 500 at this point, they're not minus 130 favorites. I'm not saying it's going to be drastically different considering how I'm not discrediting the Angels. If you look at base runs on Fangraphs, the Angels are one of the best teams in baseball. And I think your future might be live at this point, especially if DeGrom isn't going to come back this year for Texas. So from that standpoint, record-wise, are you with me that if the Dodgers were playing better, 15, 16 games over 500, something along those lines, they're not this cheap or around this price?
Yeah, I think the market definitely does react to those things at times. Like, you're definitely seeing it, I think, with Cincinnati. I mean, plug all these same players into Cincinnati 2 months ago, and there's absolutely no way they're like pushing minus 200 in multiple games. I know it's the Rockies and the Royals, but still, I think that you do sometimes find some value fading hot teams, if that's what you're getting at.
Overvalued teams. And
yeah.
And that may not come to fruition tonight. Not that you're saying, not that your analysis revolved around fade the hot team. That's not what you're implying by any means, and I'm not trying to insinuate that at all. I was just bringing up another angle that some handicappers might incorporate, and not really from a situational spot perspective, even though some handicappers do incorporate that. I was more so meaning it from the market devaluing the Dodgers because of their struggles to the point where it's also created a little bit of value from that angle.
Yeah, and I think you've seen it all year with the Orioles, how the market really does tend to be slow, though, to be honest. Like, overall, like the Orioles, I mean, you just, every day you look up and when they're playing somebody decent and they were still plus 140 for 2 months, So I think the market still doesn't really believe in the Orioles, to be honest. But yeah.
How could you?
I mean, I think I don't necessarily right now with their injuries, but I do think this is a very, very good lineup when they're healthy.
And bullpen.
Yeah, I mean, it's great, but like these guys have an ERA of 1.7 or what. I mean, that can't possibly continue, one would think. But yeah, the Orioles are a very interesting team because of the way, I mean, when outside of their top guys, the bullpen's been atrocious, I think. So
yeah, for sure. When in terms of holding on to a lead, and then you factor in Bautista alone in the ninth that's I'm not saying he may not give up a run here or there over the next month or so. That happens with any reliever, a given blown save here or there. But that's real. His stuff is real, and we saw that going back to last year too.
Yeah, absolutely. Except for Alexis Diaz. He'll never give up a run.
No spite at all there. Anything else, Mo, on Dodgers, Angels, or the market in general? Because I think it's a fascinating conversation we are having here, and we don't really get to it that often, and we'll probably get to it more now that the NBA and NHL have wrapped up and people are starting to get more into baseball betting.
Not really, especially I would say I'm a little down right now on, like I said, what the Angels are running out there. We'll see how things progress for them injury-wise and if Mike Trout remembers how to hit a baseball.
Not that I want to factor back into this, but no, I'm going to save it. I'm going to tease it because we've gone long on this video to begin with, but we really should do, I think, the one standalone video we will do this week for anybody that is still watching. We appreciate those who are. I think this is a fun market analysis conversation. We'll probably do something on division futures, long shot division futures, because we've seen a lot of movement for a team like the Reds, for instance, that have jolted up way up into the NL Central standings, all the way up into first place, for instance. And they were as high as 17-1, I want to say, something like that a few weeks ago. So we'll see if there's any buy low value in any team when it comes to division odds. Mo and I will do that video later in the week. But for Mo Nawara, for myself, Eli Herskovich, and for our teammates, especially our producer, Jack Roberts. Sorry we went long today, Jack. Over at thelines.com. You can follow Mo on Twitter at Mo Nawara. You can follow Jack on Twitter, I think. Give Jack a Twitter shout out at Jack Roberts. Follow the Lines on Twitter at The Lines US. Thanks for watching and listening. I'm Eli Herskovich. So long, everybody.